Hello folks, it's the Pacer Chaser again. Welcome to another one of my videos. This is something a bit different for this channel. In this one I'm going to look at Dinky Toys, buses and coaches, the ones that were produced in Britain. There were some French outline ones that were produced in the French factory and that were imported into Britain, but I'm not going to cover those today. As you can see from the opening shot here, I've got examples of just about all the ones that were produced. I've got two types missing, but I've got some pictures of those, so we'll discuss them. The catalyst for this video was that I bought one of these, the Dinky Streamline bus, on a well-known internet auction site, which indeed is where most of these have come from. And before I bought it, I wanted to know what scale it was. So I thought I'd have a quick internet search, and that turned into a slow internet search, which turned into a very, very long and frustrating internet search. And I couldn't find out on the internet what scale any of the Dinky Toys buses were. So what I did was I bought a book. I remembered reading this when I was younger, Buses Yearbook 1990, and there was a brilliant article in it by Gavin Booth called Close Enough for Jazz, where he lists the scales of the various models produced. So I got that, and then for good measure I also bought this, The History of British Dinky Toys by Cecil Gibson. This was written in 1964, it was published in 1966. And it gives the production dates of the various buses. So what I'm going to do for each one is I'm going to look at each individual casting in turn. I'm going to look at the dates it was produced, the scale it was made to, and then I'm going to look at what it was actually based on in real life as well, and we'll discuss some of that. Before I start, very quickly, a brief history of Dinky Toys. Most sources say they were first produced in 1934. There is some evidence to suggest that the first ones actually were produced in December 1933 and got into the shops just in time for Christmas 1933. They weren't actually called Dinky Toys at first, they were called Hornby Modelled Miniatures when they were first introduced. In April 1934 they were rebranded as Meccano Dinky Toys, and in August 1935 they dropped the Meccano from the name and they became known by the more familiar name of Dinky Toys. Production was paused during World War II. When the war broke out, the factory went over to war-related production. On the outbreak of war, there were quite a few models in the warehouse that had already been produced. And what they did, just coming up to Christmas each year during the war, they released a limited number of those into the shops so that a few lucky children could have a new Dinky Toy for Christmas. When the war finished in 1945, they sold off the remaining stock from the warehouse, and then production started slowly in 1946 and built up. They got to full production again in about 1948. The reason for the slow start was that materials were in fairly short supply after the war, and you've got to remember these were toys, so they couldn't really justify using scarce materials to produce toys. February 1964, the company was bought out by Lyons Brothers, who tried the hardest to broaden the appeal of the range. A few years prior to that, Corgi Toys had appeared as one of the first competitors. They marketed themselves for a while as the ones with the windows. As you can see, Dinky Toys just had holes where the windows should be, and Corgi had actual glazing. But as the 60s and 70s went on, more and more companies appeared in competition for the toy vehicle market. A lot of these took advantage of cheaper labour prices abroad. They produced the models abroad and imported them. So in 1979, Dinky Toys ceased trading. The factory in Binns Road, Liverpool, closed in November 1979. Various people have used the name since then, but that's not really relevant to our story. So looking at the buses, until the early 1950s, all the Dinky Toys were the catalogue numbers were 2 digits, generally speaking, with letters, suffixes. So the series for buses was 29. They were all 29. In the early 50s, a lot of sources seem to say 1953, but Cecil Gibson has it 1954, and given that he was far more contemporary, I'm going to take it as 1954. The models in production were renumbered into a 3-digit series, and that continued in use right through to the end of production. So the first bus that was produced, model number 29, was one of the ones I haven't got. It was this. It was marketed as the Doubledecker bus. Quite modestly marketed, to be honest, because it wasn't just any old double-decker bus. It was to 1/125 scale, so it was fairly small, to be honest. And it was based on an AEC Q-type. Now, the real vehicle, the Q-type, entered production in 1932. The last of them entered service in the early months of 1937, so they probably produced in 1936. And it was quite revolutionary. Up until then, apart from a few experimental machines, all buses had their engine at the front. The Q-Type had it in the middle, but not just in the middle, it was over to the offside. You can see on the toy there, there's like an inspection panel there, which is where the engine would have been on the real thing. And then the engine drove the back wheels via a drive shaft that was on the outside of the chassis, so it was quite revolutionary. Now, as we said, Dinky Toys were toys. They were intended for children to play with. By the 1950s and into the 60s, adults had started to collect them, but they were intended as toys for children, specifically in those long ago times for boys. You could get a catalogue every year, and they also appeared in the Meccano magazine, and there would have been features on the real vehicles there, and they would have pushed the modern. So any boy, worth his salt would have wanted the most modern vehicle. He would have wanted a toy version of it to play with to show his mates. And that's often what Dinky tried to produce, and frequently they got the fingers burnt, as we'll see. So that was probably their motivation in producing this one, because it was the most modern bus you could get. The real thing, there were 4 versions of it. There was a 2-axle trolley bus, which didn't have an engine, it had motors. 5 of those were produced, 3 for Sydney and Australia, 1 for Bradford and 1 for Southend. They produced a 3-axle motor bus, Doubledecker, which sold 1 example for London Transport. They produced a 2-axle Singledecker, which was more successful. They did 336 of those. 234 of them went to London Transport. London Transport declared it as their standard Singledecker for a while. But what Dinky modelled was this, the 2-axle double-deck motor bus. This was the poster boy of the range. I've seen various posters for AECQs reproduced in books and magazines over the years, and they always seem to feature this, the double-deck motor bus. And most of the photographs that were taken seem to have been of these. So boys would have seen these in the Meccano magazines and in various other books and magazines. They might even have seen one in real life. AEC had a demonstrator that went round various operators, and various people bought them. Unfortunately for Dinky, only 23 were produced in real life, so it wasn't a very successful model at all in real life. Sold far more as a Dinky toy than it did in reality, and that wasn't the last time that was going to happen either. But the Dinky toy was introduced in July 1934. It ceased production on the outbreak of war along with everything else, and then after the war they didn't bother to reintroduce it because the real vehicle had become obsolete. So yeah, it was produced from 1934 through to the outbreak of war, and as I say, it was 1/125 scale. Because they were all produced before the war, Dinkies tend to be more valuable if they're produced pre-war, and the cheapest one I've seen of these for sale was £225 in a similar condition to this one. Most of them were pushing 300, and that's why I haven't got one, because I can't justify that kind of money. But yeah, that was model 29. Catalogue number 29A was reserved for this, but they never actually used it. All the ones of these that were produced were model number 29, so they didn't actually use 29A. So the series continued with 29B, which was the one that started it all for me, the Streamline bus. So this was to a different scale. It was 1/90th. As you can see, it is quite small. Now, a quick note on scale for Dinkies, they're not exactly, because they were toys, they're not exactly. If I put it next to this, which is 1/76th, you can see the height's very similar. But if I go like that, the width is more or less the same, so they weren't quite as they should have been, but it's roughly 1/90th. It was introduced to the catalogue in April 1935, and it was produced until 1940, when production was suspended for the war. It was reintroduced after the war in January 1948, and it continued production until 1950. This one is a post-war one. You can tell that because it doesn't have a back window. The pre-war production had a small square window in the back, and if you look carefully you can still see the dimple where it was when they filled it in on the casting. They did it very crudely, so you can still see where it would have been. But this is a post-war version. These are far more common than the pre-war and far more affordable as well. So yeah, 1/90th scale. I know what you're thinking. What is it? Pacer Chaser? The answer is it didn't actually exist in real life. It's based on a van, and Dinky also did an edition of the van, and there it is, courtesy of Mr. Gibson's book. So the van in question was designed by Holland Coachcraft, who were from Govan in Glasgow. They didn't actually build them at first. They'd been set up in 1931 by William Hawthorne Holland. Initially they built van bodies. I should explain in the 1930s that most vans were separate bodies on chassis. If you wanted a van, you bought a chassis from somebody, and then you sent it off to your local coach builder to build a body on it. Or if you had the time and the skills, you did it yourself. So at first he just built van bodies and designed them. In 1933 two things happened. Firstly, they decided to concentrate on design and stop actually making vans. And secondly, they designed this, the Streamline van. So as they couldn't produce them, they were subcontracted to other firms to produce. There was a large fleet of them in the London area, in Twickenham. They were, as far as we know, built by a London firm called W&T Robson. Other firms that built bodies on them were S.H. Bond of Manchester, firstly of Rusholme, and then they moved to Wythenshawe, and also Henry Alexander of Edinburgh. There will have been others as well, but they're the ones that I found actually named. They were built largely on Commer or Albion chassis. Albion were from Glasgow, so it made sense that a Glasgow firm had the bodies built on Albion chassis, but there were also Commers as well. In 1936, Holland Coachcraft moved from Govan to Gateshead on Tyneside, where they moved into a new factory on the Team Valley Industrial Estate, and that gave them the ability to actually build their own vehicles. So they built their own vehicles. On the outbreak of war, two things happened to them that were caused by the government. Firstly, the government stopped civilian vehicle production, so they couldn't produce the vans anymore. And secondly, Holland Coachcraft put in for some war-related work, and the government didn't give them any contracts for it, so they had to file for bankruptcy, which they did in March 1940, and that was the end of Holland Coachcraft. Now, as far as anybody knows, all of the production was vans. None of them were produced as buses. One was converted into a bus after the war by a hire firm in Small Heath in Birmingham, and you can see there's a picture of it. It looks absolutely nothing like the actual Dinky Toy. It has all the design aesthetic of a garden shed, really, but that was converted from a van. As far as we know, the new production was all vans, and the general consensus has always been this was just a flight of fancy on the part of Dinky. But it probably wasn't. What they did, they used to visit manufacturers. So when they produced the Q-Type, they would have visited AEC, and quite possibly Park Royal had built the bodywork. They would have looked at the designs, they would have looked at buses in production. On some of the later models, they actually just saw the designs, and the Dinky Toy came out at the same time or just before the real thing. So they would have visited Holland Coachcraft and probably one of the subcontractors who built the vans as well. And it was probably mentioned to them that they intended to build a bus version of it. They may even have seen a sketch. As far as I know, the company's records have survived in the Holland family, and there is no mention of a bus design, but there may have been a rough sketch somewhere of one. So it possibly wasn't quite the flight of fancy that it appears to be. But either way, I really like it. But Dinky probably weren't doing very well. The first bus they produced sold 23 in real life, and the second one didn't exist at all. They did a bit better with 29C. That was the Doubledecker bus. Probably the best known Dinky Toy bus produced and the longest lived. This was introduced in 1938. It was to 1/76th or 00 scale. The reason for that, Hornby, the associated company, had just started to introduce their Hornby 00 range of 00 gauge model trains. So this bus was designed to fit on the layouts. So yeah, 1/76 scale. It was the first of quite a few 1/76 scale buses. They were produced from 1938. Again, production halted during the war. They were reintroduced in 1947, and it continued in production in one form or another right through to 1963. So what was it based on? And the answer to that is it was a London STL. Now, STL stood for short type lengthened. Basically, at one time, if you wanted a bus over a certain length, you had to have 3 axles. So London had a 3-axle version that was called a long type, or LT for short. And they had a 2-axle bus that was the short type, or ST for short. And then the rules were relaxed to allow slightly longer 2-axle buses, of which this was the first. So it was called a short type lengthened STL. All of the pre-war production had an AEC radiator. Now I can't really show you one because this isn't an AEC, it's very similar, but I'll show you on an EFE bus. This is obviously not a Dinky toy. So all the radiators on the Dinky buses were the same shape and size as this, but the version produced before the war would have had this large triangle and the dividing bar down the middle of this grille. In 1950, a second version was produced, which this is one of, which was apparently a guy. Now Gavin Booth doesn't make any mention of this version. This is from the Cecil Gibson book, but it had a smaller triangle and a correspondingly larger dividing bar down the front. So this is one of the guys. They were produced from 1950 to 1957, so they survived the renumbering of the casting from 29C. In the early 50s it was renumbered to 290. The AEC version, as I say, it was introduced in 1938, paused for the war, reintroduced again after the war, and then it finished production in 1950, so it was replaced by this guy version. As I say, this continued to 1957. From 1957 onwards to the end of production in 1963, they produced it with this radiator, the Leyland version, so this can be dated there. You can easily tell a post-war one because it doesn't have a staircase. If you look in this EFE Roadmaster, you can see it's got a bit of a staircase cast there. And the pre-war version of this had a staircase. The post-war ones don't. I assume it's because they were still relatively short of materials, and so the bit of metal they saved in not casting the staircase after a few models would have given them enough metal to do another bus. Most of the production had this, so it was a model of a roof box STL. The roof box was this, the route number part of the destination blind, as you can see in a box on the roof. Dinky did do a small number that didn't have that, they just had a curved roof all the way across, but most of them have got that on. And then they've got the STL style blind, the ultimate destination blind at the top there, and the bigger or intermediate or via blind there. The vast majority of production as well had these straight across wings. This one's actually broken there, so I'll demonstrate more on this one. See, the bottom of them's straight. There were a few that had a cutaway up from there, it kind of curved round into the radiator and back down the other side. That appeared to cause a fault in the metal, a weakness, because I've seen quite a few photos of those where the metal above has broken away. But they're a lot scarcer. The far more common version, roof box number and the strike wings there. So these are both post-war. As you can see, somebody's had a go at putting windows in this one, which have then fallen out. When this was introduced in 1938, it would have looked quite dated. We've mentioned the Streamline bus. There were Streamline double-deckers. They weren't very common, but they were there, and elements of that design were taken into the standard design of a lot of double-deckers. Streamlining was all the rage in the 30s. There were Streamline trains, think the Mallard, the famous steam locomotive. So bus design had moved on quite a lot from the early 30s. The rail STLs were introduced in around 1932, so they were already looking quite dated by the time this model was introduced in 1938. By the time it was taken out of production in 1963, they would have looked positively archaic. In the 1950s, platform doors appeared, so they still had the door at the back, but they had actual doors on it. And then as the 50s went on, doors tended to move down to just behind the front wheel there, along with a staircase that moved to the same position on the other side. And then by the end of the 50s, you had vehicles like this Atlantean, where the engine was at the back and a door at the front. So they would have looked absolutely archaic, but it was still a good seller for Dinky, and as I say, remained in production until 1963. So that was 29C, renumbered 290 in the early 50s. 29D was a French produced bus, which was imported, so we're not looking at that one. And then the 29C was the last of the pre-war ones that was introduced. The rest of them are post-war only. Starting with this one, 29E, the single-deck bus. It is in fact a coach, not a bus, but it was marketed as single-deck bus. It has, this one has what appears to be a Leyland radiator. It was based on a Duple A-type, but it was suitably generic in its styling to represent anything really. It was introduced in March 1948 and it remained in production just till 1952. Dinky were quite unlucky because the design of single deck buses went on in leaps and bounds in the late 40s, early 50s. By the early 50s, most of them had their engine under the floor. Not obviously this one's got it, would have had it at the front in real life, but manufacturers would move the engine under the floor in the middle, so you could have the door at the front, you could have and you could have a full front as well. So that looked far more modern. People didn't want these anymore, they looked dated. So sales of half cab buses like this in real life absolutely bombed. And as such, Dinky took this out of production in 1952 after just 4 years of production. They were quite unlucky. They couldn't have foreseen in 1948 that bus design in real life would move on like that. This was a fairly generic model, and it represented vehicles that were entering service in the thousands in real life at the time it was brought in. Duple, who built the body it was based on, were based at Hendon in London. They moved to Blackpool in the 1960s, but we don't need to dwell on that too much. Some people say this was a Maudsley, but it doesn't appear to have the same radiator as the Maudsleys that were introduced later on. But yeah, nice little model. As you can see, this one needs to be restored. But again, 1/76 scale like the 29C that went before it, so you could put it on your model railway. So the next model that was introduced was 29F. This was brought in August 1950. And it was marketed as the observation coach, which, as you can see, it's got these observation windows at the front here. They're also known in real life as 1.5 deckers or half deckers sometimes. This has the Maudsley radiator. As you can see there, Maudsley, it was a bit of a strange choice for Dinky. The big hitters really were Leyland and AEC. Maudsley were from Coventry. They joined the ACV group, Associated Commercial Vehicles, which put them in with AEC, who built the Q-Type we saw earlier, and Crosley Motors in 1948. They joined that group. But then Maudsley models were phased out by ACV from around 1950 onwards. A few were built in the 1950s, but they were actually AECs. They were just badge engineered. They had a Maudsley badge on an AEC bus. So Maudsley was a strange choice for Dinky, really, but not the first strange choice that they made, and not the last. So yeah, introduced August 1950, again 1/76 scale. It was based on a Maudsley, and the bodywork was by a firm called James Whitson and Company, who were from Useley near West Drayton in Middlesex. They built this style of body on Maudsley chassis in real life. There was some debate on the internet whether this actually existed, and Gavin Booth mentions in his article that he didn't think the real combination of Maudsley chassis and Whitson body existed, but it did. Somebody found a photo of one that they put on the internet, and then there's a production list that suggests there are actually 7 of them. They also built the bodywork on Leyland chassis, on AECs and on Foddens. The rail thing was built between 1949 and 1952. It didn't really catch on, this design. The idea of it was quite simple. The old coaches like this, you put all the luggage in a boot at the back, which would have been there. But people who went on touring holidays in those days tended to be the more well-to-do. So the more working class people couldn't afford those kind of holidays, and they couldn't have the time off anyway. So they tended to carry a lot of luggage on extended tours, and they struggled to fit it in the boot. The idea of this was you raised the floor towards the back. You put the seats higher, which gave you this thing that you could see forward, hence observation coach. But the main reason for it was that you could put a bigger luggage locker underneath the floor, so you could fit more luggage in it. Most of the ones that were sold for airport shuttle use. But you've got to remember, in the early 50s, that airport use wasn't anything like it is today. Again, it was the preserve of rich people was flying. Not many people flew, so it wasn't big business, and they didn't really sell a lot of them in real life. They reckon between all of the chassis, about 32 or 33 were sold with this design of bodywork. And as we said, only 7 of them had the Maudsley chassis that Dinky chose to represent. It's still a lovely model. I'll get this painted up and put into my collection at some point. So 29G was the luxury coach. Again, it was based on the Maudsley. Got the same radiator as the observation coach. This wasn't one of the sort of post-war full front vehicles I was just talking about. Some operators before the war and just after, when these half cabs were still in vogue, had specified a full front just to give them a more modern look, but they tended to be more expensive, so they basically used them on touring work. So the Dinky version was called a luxury coach for that reason. That's what the real things would have been used on. So again, it had the Maudsley radiator. It married this to the Duple A-type body that's on the half cab. But there is a bit of a difference. This one's got a divided window at the back. I'm not sure if that shouldn't have actually. I think somebody might have just cut that one out. But yeah, nice little model. Introduced in April of 1951. It survived long enough to be renumbered to 281 in the new numbering system in 1954. It carried on in production until 1960. Incidentally, I forgot to mention the observation coach also carried on in production until 1960, although it didn't sell many in real life. Again, it was far more popular as a dinky toy. Because it was a toy, it was distinctive, so it would have sold. But both of those stayed in the range till 1960. And again, both of them sold more units in real life than they would have done. Sorry, more units as a dinky toy, should I say, than they would have done in real life. So another famous dinky toy now, or perhaps should we say infamous. This is 29H, introduced in September of 1952. Renumbered to catalogue number 282 in 1954. And it remained in the range until 1960, so it was withdrawn at the same time as the other two. And this is a Duple Roadmaster, built on a Leyland Royal Tiger chassis in real life. Some sources say they were also built on Guy Arab UF chassis, but I think the ones that were actually produced, although the bodywork was very similar, except it had more ornate sort of workings around the wheels here. It was generally known as a Worldmaster on a Guy chassis, not a Roadmaster. So the Duple Roadmaster on a Leyland Royal Tiger is what this represents. This went into production just before, I think, the real thing, or certainly at the same time. The real thing was produced 1951 to 1953, so it wasn't in production for very long. Only about 21 of them were actually built, so it was another flop in real life. Dinky seemed to have developed a habit of representing these types. They were known as Iron Dukes in real life because they were metal framed at a time when a lot of coach bodies were still wooden. And as you can see, there was a lot of metal work and not much space for the windows. But yeah, about 21 sold in real life, so again, far more popular as a dinky toy than it was in reality. Introduced, as I say, September 1952, deleted from the range in 1960, and again it was 1/76th scale. This model perhaps did the real thing a favour, because it made it well known. I mean, normally a model that only sold 21 vehicles would have faded into total obscurity. I believe there's actually only one of the real ones preserved, but it's a much better known type among enthusiasts than it would have been were it not for the dinky toy. Indeed, Oxford Diecast introduced a scale model version of it more recently, and they probably wouldn't have done that if it wasn't for the fame that the type had gained from this. So the real thing has a debt of gratitude to Dinky. So Dinky hadn't been having much luck really. They'd done a half cab that had become obsolete in real life. They'd done a couple of vehicles, an observation coach that didn't really sell many, and a luxury coach that was quite dated, with Maudsley radiators. The Maudsley chassis weren't very popular, and then they'd managed to build a toy where they only sold about 21 in real life. Could things get better for them? Well, no, not really. This was the first model introduced, or the first bus model introduced after the renumbering schemes. This was model number 283 in the catalogue. Introduced in October of 1956, it actually remained in production until 1963. Like all of these, it was 1/76 scale, so it could fit on your 00 model railway. And it was a Harrington Contender. Now the real Harrington Contender, built by Thomas Harrington and Sons of Hove. They used comma running units. It was what was called an integral vehicle, so instead of being a separate chassis and body, or body on chassis should I say, the running units, like the subframe with the axles on and the engine gearbox etc., were built into the body structure, so it was kind of all one structure. Now there were three types of these in real life. They built about 51 or so across all three. There was a coach version that had a curved window line like this one, and a different front. The front kind of was a sort of V shape. That was the more common version. There was a bus version that had the striped window line, and then there was the one that Dinky chose to represent, which was a coach with a striped window line and this rather bulbous grille at the front. And this type was only supplied to one customer, which was BOAC, the British Overseas Aircraft Corporation, in whose livery it was produced. They did try and produce one in a more generic beige and red livery, but in real life they all went to BOAC, and only 28 of this version were actually delivered, 19 of which were sent to work at airports abroad. So there were only nine of them in this country. So it wasn't a big seller, and again, Dinky kind of backed the wrong horse, if you like. So there was a bit of a hiatus for a while. 1960, as we said, the half cab, the observation coach, and the luxury coach, and the Roadmaster were all phased out, which left just the airport coach that was marketed, this Harrington Contender, and the faithful old double-decker bus, the STL, in production, of the ones we've seen so far. In 1960, we think, because one source tells me this was introduced in 1960, another one says 1964, but the Dinky Collectors Association say it was introduced in 1960, so I'm going to go with them. It was produced till 1965. Was this? It's a model 295. It's a minibus rather than a bus, as you can see. The real thing was built on a standard Atlas van by a firm called Kennex, who were from Dover. They were a subsidiary of a firm called the Folkestone Motor Company. In 1962, the rail firm were bought out by Martin Walter, and the production was moved to Folkestone. But this was the Kennex Kenny Brake. Now, a lot of real life producers in the early 60s were making minibuses out of these little vans. They were producers' vans, as I say, a standard Atlas van. But most of them just punched the holes for the windows in the side, put glazing in and put seats in them, and that was it. As you can see, Kennex raised the roof line. This is the one Dinky chose to represent. As you can also see, there was a bit of an attempt now to compete with the Dinky Toys. They'd put windows and seats in this. So it had an interior, it had windows. It's also got a bit of a suspension, as you can see. So it was produced between 1960 and 1965. And it was to 1/43rd scale, so they'd finally moved away from doing everything exclusively for the 00 model railway. So yeah, 1/43rd scale, catalogue number 295. The next striped bus release that they did, which is the second one I haven't got, because again they are ridiculously expensive. I think the cheapest one I've seen was about £90. It was this, catalogue number 949 in this form, the Wayne school bus, the American school bus. It's also done as a Continental touring coach with a catalogue number of 953. There was disappointment when this was released. Obviously they'd done a few prototypes that didn't really sell in real life, and then it was announced that another Dinky bus model was coming along, and everybody rubbed their hands and then disappeared. So it was brought in February 1961, and it was produced until around 1965. The Continental touring coach version, which was painted turquoise and cream, that was introduced in 1963 and ceased production in 1965. It was just an attempt to try and make it more popular. People didn't want a yellow school bus. You know, the boys who played with Dinky Toys would never have seen an American yellow school bus, and the adult collectors who had sprung up by that point wouldn't have wanted one either. So it wasn't massively popular. So that's why they did the Continental touring coach version of it. The real thing was built by the Wayne Corporation of Richmond, Indiana. It wasn't very successful. The vast majority of their production was the standard American school bus that you see on TV programmes and in films with a sticking out bonnet. They did a few of these sort of more modern looking ones, but it didn't really sell in real life. And as I say, it wasn't popular as a Dinky toy. It was deleted in 1965. And it was produced to 1/56th scale, which made it even less popular. If it had been sort of 00 scale, they might have sold a few more. But yeah, 1/56. So they'd had quite a few flops and failures, really. The Kenny Brake accepted, because although that's not a striped bus, the actual striped bus models they'd not had a lot of luck with, as we've seen. Could it get any better? Well, yes, it could. The next bus they introduced was this one, model 292, the Atlantean bus. Some of them were also produced with 293. There's actually a 293 because it's got the BP adverts on it. In the earlier days, they produced various different colour schemes on buses without changing the catalogue number. As time went on, they started to do different ones, different liveries with different catalogue numbers. So this is a 293. Most of the production I think were 292s. Now they'd hedged the bets with the Atlantean. The real thing, the prototypes had appeared in the mid 1950s. They got into production towards the end of 1958. So Dinky already knew that it was a good seller. They were entering service in fleets up and down the country. It was selling really well. This was produced in July 1962. So by that point, Dinky already knew they were onto a winner, and it was going to sell well, and it did. It remained in production until 1968. It wasn't the longest production run. I think probably the reason for that, in real life, attempts were being made to modernise the Atlantean, but there seemed to be no consensus as to which way to go. Various operators were specifying wildly different body designs, so I think Dinky kind of wanted to wait. They were probably busy with other projects as well, but I think they wanted to wait until they saw which ones kind of established themselves before they committed to producing one of the new, more modern looking Atlanteans, just in case they got it wrong again. But yeah, it's actually a pretty decent model. You see it's got seats and windows, although one of the windows is broken on this. It was quite clever. To get it apart, you pull out these what look like fog lights on the front. They pull out the pins and then the chassis drops out. But yeah, lovely little model, nicely detailed. It's hard to remember it was actually produced as a toy because it does look like a scale model. It was ever so slightly larger than 176 scale. It was 175th for some reason. If I stand it next to a 176 scale later Atlantean, you can see they look very, very similar. This would be slightly higher up if it had tyres, but even so, you can't really tell that they're different. But it was 175th, not 176th. And as I say, produced from 1962 to 1968. So the next bus in the series was also a winner, actually. And it was model number 952, which was the Bedford Val with the duple Vega Major body. Now this kind of managed to cover two bases, because I think it was probably aimed at the younger end of the market, younger children, because it's huge. It's 1/45th scale. As you can see, it's massive compared to the 176 scale buses. There we go. So yeah, I think it's probably aimed at the younger end of the market, because obviously, generally speaking, the younger the target market for toys, the bigger they are. Yes, you could get the tyres off it. Yes, it had an opening boot flap that tended to detach itself. As you can see, this one's got it missing. But you have to remember it was the mid-60s. If a child started to choke on the boot lid of their duple Vega Major Dinky toy, they'd probably get a crack around the back of the legs for swallowing it in the first place. So yeah, it was a different era. But they got quite a lot of play value. As I said, they had an opening boot lid. They also had this. If you put batteries in it, now this one won't work because it's got no bulbs and no wiring back look of it. If you put a battery in there and just put the retaining clip across. The idea was, you pushed it down, you see the suspension's quite springy. And if you pushed it down to one side, you can just about see the wheels steer. And then this light here, the indicator, would begin to flash as you did that. And we let it up again, it would stop. And then if you did it on the other side like that, that one would flash. So they got some play value in it. But it's also quite a decent model. If you look at the grille there, originally it would have had these jewelled headlights, which looked a bit iffy, to be honest. Most of these are missing on this one. But yeah, the grille is really well detailed. You see it's got all the panel lines there. The shape of it's absolutely bang on. So yeah, it's kind of a really good model and a really good toy as well, all in one. The real thing, the Bedford Val chassis that it was built on, they sold over 900 of them. The main bodybuilders on them were duple with this design, the Vega Major, and Plaxton with their Panorama. You may know the Bedford Val chassis because it was quite well known as a six-wheeler, but was known as a Chinese six, so you with the two axles at the front and just one at the back. The film The Italian Job, that wasn't one of these, it was a Harrington Legionnaire body. And also the Beatles used the Plaxton Panorama in their Magical Mystery Tour film. But, Dinky couldn't have known that various Bedford Vals with different bodies were going to become famous. And this is probably actually the best known body outside of the films, certainly among bus enthusiasts. It was quite different for the time with these sloping pillars. It was very popular in real life. They built quite a lot of them, so Dinky had backed a winner. for once. But yeah, as we said, 1/45 scale, catalogue number 952. They did various different colour schemes, but I think they only had one catalogue number, so there was no consistency in that sense. But yeah, it was introduced in January of 1964. It remained in production right through to 1977, whereas the real Bedford Val chassis had ceased production in 1973, but the toy continued for 4 more years. So yeah, January 1964 through to 1977. Almost to the end of the Dinky Toys story. 5 months after it was introduced, June 1964, they introduced this, another winner, the well-known AEC Roadmaster. Probably the most famous bus ever made in real life. Plenty of them still around on the roads now in various guises, not in normal service generally, but tour buses, wedding hires, etc, etc. So yeah, Dinky were on to a winner. This was a really good representation of one actually. It was 1/69 scale, although it looks like 1/76. Again, you can see it's very slightly higher than the Atlantean. If we just put the camera down there, you can see the height difference. So yeah, 1/69 scale. Slightly unusual, but they didn't look too out of place on a 00 model railway. It's quite a nice model. From the side it looks nice. Again, you've got seats, you've got glazing. From the back it's absolutely cracking. If I stand it next to my AFE scale model, you can see it really does look the part. It went a bit wrong, the Dinky one around the front. For some reason the front doesn't really capture the look of the rail thing. And they didn't put the AEC badge on the grille either, which is a sort of notable feature of the rail thing. But never mind that, it was a winner. It was already well known when it was introduced in 1964, and this remained in production right through to 1979 when production stopped altogether. So it was an absolute winner that they produced, and it was nice to see them doing well after so many failures. So yeah, catalogue number 289, 1/69 scale AEC Roadmaster. The next vehicle that they introduced, catalogue number 283 to 1/64 scale, was this. Introduced in 1971 and in production to 1976. It was based on the Red Arrow, which was a London transport bus. Anywhere else in the country when this chassis went into production it was an AEC Swift, but most of London's were called the AEC Merlin. And they modelled the Red Arrow version of it. Was that a good choice? Well, yeah, it wasn't bad actually. They produced quite a lot of them. They're still pretty common nowadays. Again, they managed to combine a decent model. Yeah, the headlights are overscale, and the registration plate that would have been on the front, they did have a registration number when produced. That covered the lug that locates the chassis into the body, so it was overscale. But apart from that, you can see you've got all the grills and things, destination blind modelled. All the panels are there as well. Got the grills at the back, so it's a nice model. It's a shame it was to 1/64 scale because you know, it looked pretty good on the model railway otherwise. But again, they combined play value with it as well. If you look at this little lever on the back, it doesn't want to work now. It does work, honestly. There you go. It makes a bell ring. This one doesn't have its doors anymore for some reason, but you can see there's a switch on the off side there. And if I just zoom in there, you can see the mechanism moving as I move the switch. So the doors, if it had them fitted, would open and close. Again, this was bought from a well-known internet site on account of its cheapness. But yeah, as I said, was it a good prototype for them to model? Well, yeah. Again, the magazines, the books that boys that these were aimed at would have been reading, they would have featured these quite heavily. The Red Arrow was quite revolutionary. They only had seats in the back part. They could only seat 25 people in real life. The front bit was a massive standing area. And then to get on, you had a flat fare system. And there were turnstiles inside. So you got in, you put your money in a turnstile, and then the turnstile let you into the bus. So they would have been quite well publicised. And again, you know, boys wanted to play with the modern thing. So it was a good choice. Yes, there were single-deckers outside of London, across the country. They'd been briefly popular in the mid-60s. At the time this was introduced, in 1971, they weren't really popular anymore. What had happened, the one-man operation, it was then called, nowadays one-person operation, of double-deckers was still illegal, apart from a few trial areas in the 60s. So operators wanted to bring in one-man buses, so they had to use single-deckers, because they were struggling to recruit staff anyway, and obviously it was easier to recruit one person to operate the bus than it was to recruit two. Plus passenger use was declining, so they needed to save money, and so they wanted to cut staff back. It sounds very familiar, all this, doesn't it, to a modern audience. So yeah, they wanted to bring in one-man operation, again as it was then called, so they had to use single-deckers. It turned out it wasn't that much cheaper because they were more expensive to buy, and they tended to use more fuel than the traditional vehicles that they were replacing. They also needed more maintenance. The maintenance took longer because everything was more awkwardly laid out. So they were off the road for longer and not earning money. And then a lot of the chassis that were produced were sort of rushed into production, and then with fairly rushed bodywork on top. The bodywork tended to fall to pieces, and they weren't very reliable. So, you know, taking all that together, if you wanted an unreliable vehicle that fell to pieces and occasionally caught fire, then brilliant. But of course operators didn't. Later on in the 60s, rumours went round that the government were going to legalise the one-man operation of double-deckers, so single-deck orders absolutely flopped. Everyone started to buy double-deckers again, outside of London, who bought a load of these. So the fact that they were still entering service when this went into production in 1971, and as I said, they would have been well publicised as red arrows, with the turnstiles, with the standing area. The idea was the services ran around central London. They connected the main railway stations to each other, and also to the shopping and business areas. So areas like the city. And they were designed to carry large numbers of people for a short amount of time, hence the standee layout. But they would have got a lot of publicity. So again, boys would have wanted to play with a toy that was based on this. It should have a grey band stuck along it with the words Red Arrow on, but as you can see, this one again needs restoration. But yeah, nice model. So it phased out in 1976 because the rail thing were introduced over a few years. But catalogue number 283. So we've only got a couple of releases to go now. And the next one that was introduced in 1972 was this, catalogue number 296. It was marketed as Luxury Coach, and it was actually a representation of a Duple Viceroy 37. So when they went to the Duple factory to view the Vega Major, it obviously made a bit of an impression. They'd forgiven them the transgression of the Roadmaster. So yeah, Duple Viceroy 37. They were quite common in real life. They were built on Leyland Leopard chassis, AEC Reliances, and on lightweight ones such as Bedfords. Again, it's not a bad little representation of one, really. It's got all the sort of trim, the panel lines, the Viceroy 37 in the side that the real one would have had, the grille. It does use overscale wheels, the same wheels as the Atlantean that was introduced a little bit later, so they're overscale. They do detract from the look a little bit, and the yellow glazing, but again, you've got to remember they were made as toys. As you can see, this one's quite small. I put it next to the 176th bust there. You can see how small it is. They were produced to 1/95th scale, and I think the idea of it was that you could put it in your pocket. So, you know, if a kid was off around to their friends to play, or they wanted to set the bus to school to play with in their playtime, you just put it in the pocket and take it. Obviously, you weren't getting the Bedford Valley in your pocket anytime soon. But yeah, introduced in 1972, remained in the range till 1978, so almost to the end. And yeah, a lovely, competent little toy. And now we come to the last bust that Dinky introduced. This one was introduced in 1973. It remained in production until 1978. There were various different catalogue numbers. Probably the best known is 295, which was the yellow pages. It was, as the name suggests, yellow with yellow pages stuck all over it. In real life, all over advert buses were still a fairly new thing, so they got noticed. A lot of local politicians would try and get them banned. They thought they were gaudy and tacky and all the rest of it, and they devalued the local bus fleets and things like that. So they got noticed. So Dinky, with 295, scored a double whammy. They got a modern vehicle into the toy range, and they also got one that was being noticed in real life for having an all-over advert. They also did a 291 that was orange with stickers for kenning, car dealerships and rentals and destination Chesterfield. And this one, which was 297, as you can see, it was produced in 1977, this version, to commemorate the Queen's Silver Jubilee. You've got to the 1977 Jubilee from 1952, which was when the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II was. The model itself, or the toy should I say, is a really competent representation. However, it's not actually an Atlantean. As any bus enthusiast will tell you, the engine bustle at the back, the cover around the engine's off a Daimler Fleet line. You can tell with these sort of ridgings at the bottom. But it was marketed as Leyland Atlantean. You can see the Atlantean bus. And it's a nice model. What they actually produced, it was a representation of one of the prototype vehicles supplied to Singledeck at PTE. Now, in the late 60s, various passenger transport executives, or PTEs, were set up in conurbations to oversee transport provision, and they generally operated the buses in their area. Singledeck was South East Lancashire, North East Cheshire, which operated around the Manchester area. And they inherited a lot of different types of bus from the constituent companies, as did most of the PTEs. So they sought to introduce their own standard, and they built various prototypes into the early 70s. 5 of them look like this. The rail vehicles were registered TNB 757 to 761K. A 2-door bodywork built by Northern Counties of Wigan, and this is a representation of one of them. They looked fairly similar to Atlanteans that were supplied to Chesterfield Transport, which is why the orange version, I think, had Chesterfield on the destination blind. But it looked suitably similar to other products of other manufacturers that people up and down the country would have been running to make it have more general appeal. It's another well-known model, and they're very easy to find. If you have a look on the internet for any for sale, there's loads of them usually, in a variety of price ranges. This is one of the most pristine I've ever seen. It was a very cheap price as well, but it's still got the destination stickers on, which a lot of them haven't. But yeah, produced from 1973 to 1978. As I said, this version would have been 1977 only, obviously from the markings. Back to 1/76 scale, so it would go on your model railway layout. I'm not quite sure how close to scale it was. As you can see, if you put it next to this 1/76, yes, the rail vehicle of this would have been slightly smaller, but perhaps not as small as this one makes it look. And that was it. As I say, that remained in production until 1978, leaving just the Roadmaster in production up to the end of Dinky in 1979. I'll just mention there was a kit version of some of the vehicles that we've seen as well. The AEC Merlin, the Red Arrow Singledecker, the Roadmaster there, and this version of the Atlantean. What you got was the body shell, which was one piece, and the floor unit from the upper deck. The seats on the bottom deck are actually cast as part of the chassis, so you got the chassis, engine bustle, wheels, all that already complete. You got the plastic seats and floor unit from the upper deck, 2 different glazing units, and then the main body shell, and you also got like a pot of paint with it as well. The idea was you took it, you painted the body shell in the colour that had come with it, and then you put it together. Very simply a case of just turning the body shell upside down, dropping the upstairs windows in, followed by the upstairs seats, followed by the downstairs windows. Then you put the chassis in. At the back it located in there, so you sort of slid it in there, put it down, and you put this plate in at the front, put the screw in, tightened it up, and that was it. So they weren't, kits in the full sense. I think it was just to add some play value and to try and get more kids interested in them at a time when the market share was dwindling. Most of them seem to have just been bought by adult collectors and put to one side. There's still a lot of them for sale, completely unbuilt. I've only seen a couple ever for sale that have been built from the kits and say so. But yeah, they were catalogue numbers 1023 for the Merlin, 1017 for the Roadmaster, and 1018 for the Atlantean. And they were introduced in the 1970s. As well as the paint, you also got some transfers. So on the Atlantean version, you got this national sticker. You didn't get the sort of Silver Jubilee or anything else, you just got that. But yeah, and that was the end of the range. As I say, they finished production in 1979. But there's still loads of them about. So I just thought I'd give you that overview, as I say, scales, what they were actually based on, because I couldn't find the information on the internet. So I hope you found it useful. I hope it saved you a frustrating internet search. As always, thank you for joining me. Take care, and I'll see you again soon. Bye for now.